Strolling in, so we are live. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to From Corbyn to Sanders, our Zionist organizations targeting progressive politicians, and this is part 2 of that discussion. I'm Jamil, and I'll be opening this talk as well as assisting with the Q&A portion after the panel's discussion wraps up. It looks like we've got a good turnout. Like I said, people are still streaming in, but we're having a little bit of difficulty with live streaming this to Miko's Facebook page, but we will eventually get that sorted out. So if there are folks who didn't register ahead of time, you can let them know to head over to facebook.com/Miko Peled official, and they'll be able to watch the live stream from there. So this is part 2 of a webinar series that is being hosted by author, speaker, and activist Miko Peled. And we're not shy about slinging books around here, so do yourself a favor if you haven't already and pick up a copy of Miko's books. He's got The General's Son and his second book, Injustice, Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. So in addition to having Miko leading the panel, we're really fortunate to have some of the best thinkers and reporters on this topic. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to them. So we have, first off, Anya Parampil, journalist at The Gray Zone. We've got SD Chandler, who is board chair at JVP Action and host at the Middle East on Focus radio show. And then lastly, we have Asa Winstanley, who is a journalist and associate editor at the Electronic Intifada. So today's discussion is centered around special interest pro-Israel groups and their targeting of progressive politicians and movements. You know, everything from the ongoing anti-Semitism smear campaign that was aimed at UK Labour to US-based political action committees that are working in collaboration with different party strategists to unseat progressives who support maybe even the most basic semblance of Palestinian rights. So with all of this reflection that is happening on both the Sanders campaign, but also reflecting on UK Labour's upset late last year, we want to bring the panel together to discuss and share reporting and analysis on the influence of special interest pro-Israel political groups, you know, as it relates to progressive political campaigns, their corresponding movements, and more specifically, those progressives who actually are advocating for some kind of Palestinian justice and freedom. So some quick housekeeping for this event before I hand things over to Miko. We're going to keep this event to under 2 hours with the first 60 to 80 minutes dedicated to the panel discussion. But we also want to make room for audience Q&A after the panel discussion has wrapped up. So if you're on Zoom, you'll see a Q&A button on your Zoom window toolbar towards the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question you think of at any point in the event that you want the panel to discuss, use that Q&A tool, ask your question, and our event admin, Michael, he'll be collecting those throughout the event. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. If you're having any technical difficulties or want to comment about what is being discussed with the other people watching, there is an event chat room, which Michael will be monitoring and responding to, and we'll also be referencing links and reports that the panelists talk about in there as well. I think that should do it for the housekeeping. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Miko Peled to get the discussion started.
Thank you, Jamil. And thank you all for being part of this panel, and thank you all for everybody who is participating. I see the number of participants is growing. And thanks, Michael, for your work behind the scenes. The topic is Corbyn to Sanders, part 2 of the discussion on whether or not pro-Israeli groups are working to influence elections and to get in the way of progressive politicians, particularly progressive politicians who have a strong stance on the issue of Palestine, from succeeding. We just saw in the UK a candidate for prime minister who was really only a few thousands of votes away from becoming prime minister, and he's probably the most progressive on many issues, but particularly on Palestine, the most progressive candidate we've ever seen anywhere, really, in the West on this issue of Palestine. The good news is he came very close. The bad news is that eventually he was brought down. or he failed, and the accusations of anti-Semitism and so forth, and supporting terrorism, and all of this, all of these sort of a whole laundry list of accusations that were untrue had a lot to do with that. And here in the U.S., we had also what is relative to the U.S. a very progressive candidate who was really very close to becoming Democratic nominee for president twice. Here he was calling, and this is the man who was calling to condition aid to Israel with Israel's compliance with international law, and criticized Israel for bombing and killing thousands of people in Gaza. We've never heard this sort of discourse in mainstream American politics before. And twice, Bernie Sanders, who also happens to be Jewish, has not succeeded, had to throw in the towel. Some people may say too early, but nonetheless, he did not become the candidate. The questions that we're raising, the question that we raised last time and that we're raising again today, are: number one, what evidence do we have that this is actually true, that this claim that Zionist organizations, pro-Israel organizations, be they evangelical or Jewish, are behind this? The second question is, we want to identify what tactics they're using. And then the third question, how do we tackle this, and how do we move forward to oppose this, but also to move the agenda forward, the agenda of, particularly the agenda that deals with Palestinian rights. Esti, Anya, Asa, all three of you have been writing a lot about things that are relevant to this issue. You've been involved. You've been commentating on American politics and American policy decisions and what is influencing these decisions. Right now, you may have heard that Gilad Erdan, who was who still is, but has been for a while, Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, will now be Israel's ambassador to the U.S. and to the UN, I believe. That's two tough jobs. I don't know how one guy can do it, but the point is that I'm hearing that there is a great deal of credit given to him to what has happened to Corbyn and what is happening here in the United States. So now supposedly he's coming to the most important front on this, on Israel's fight, or Israel's war against the Palestine Solidarity Movement here in the United States. And whether or not this is true, this is something we definitely need to discuss. And Esti, I wanted to start with you. Is there any evidence? I mean, do you know, or can you say if there's any evidence? First of all, there is such intervention of pro-Zionist groups in American politics, but also Erdan and the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs actually having a hand in what is happening
here. Sure. That has been the case for a long time, both in American politics and, of course, on campuses. I mean, there's plenty of evidence showing that Israel's government is involved in these things, from the suppression of the documentary film "The Lobby USA" by Israel directly, which documents Israeli meddling in U.S. elections. It documents Israeli government agents directing and guiding the establishment and work of US-based Israel Zionist support groups, examples being the Israel on Campus Coalition, the Israel Project, who then collect information and report back to Israeli government agents. And I don't know that it was included in the film, but there's a newer organization called the Democratic Majority for Israel, which includes people who worked at the Israeli embassy and now likely, freelance for the government. The other, evidence is in the reactions to the incompatibility of the progressive movement and Zionism, which are easily shown on a T-shirt like the one I'm wearing, if you can see it, but also are very evident in Democratic Party politics. And you see that on every level, from national party politics where you have, the thwarting of people's campaigns, even for party officers, like the chair of the Democratic Party. You have groups popping up like Progressive Zionists of California, which even had to change their name because they started out calling themselves Progressive Zionists of the California Democratic Party, as if they were an officially sanctioned group. And they popped up about 2 years ago, almost definitely as a blowback to a progressive resolution that was passed in May of 2017, which was ultimately became the policy of the California Democratic Party, which was far more progressive than anything seen before it. It included language like the California Democratic Party favors a US policy that would work through the United Nations and other international bodies, as well as with Israel and the representatives of the Palestinian people, for a just peace based on full equality and security for Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike, human rights and international law. It goes on, it quotes Bernie Sanders. It says that the California Democratic Party rejects any effort to restrict or discourage the open public discourse on issues surrounding Israel and Palestine, disavows conflation of criticism of a country's policies with hatred of its people, but also opposes anti-Semitic and Islamophobic language brought into the debate, and opposes any attempt to restrict or penalize those who exercise their right to express their views through nonviolent action, i.e. BDS, to affect change. And, there was a massive freak out. I mean, the bottom line is that they saw that the party's base, that the Democratic voters were behind this, because when this came forward, it was put on a slate called a consent calendar, where all the items get put on it, get voted up or down, and then there's a chance to pull things off, and yet they chose not to. Other issues on it got pulled for debate and for a floor vote, and yet they decided not to pull it. And I'm sure that was because there were, hundreds of media there. And how would it look if all the media saw a vote getting taken and winning 70% to 30, which is likely what would have happened? So they quietly let it pass and not, hope that it wouldn't get any attention. But, this kind of pushback, and these people are being, directed by people, who work under Gilad Erdan.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot. Anya, let me ask you, you've been reporting about American politics, American foreign policy a lot, from Venezuela all the way to Palestine and Gaza. From both places you've been, and you've reported some really sent some fantastic reporting. And I've seen you reporting a lot about the powers behind, or the powers that are moving the American policy, foreign policy, a lot as well. What's your take on this first question regarding the evidence we have for the meddling of pro-Zionist groups in American politics, in American foreign policy?
I just want to start by saying thank you to Miko for inviting all of us to participate in this, and to Jamil for helping put this together, and to all of our guests for joining us for this important discussion. I should probably also start by mentioning that our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, broke quarantine today, and we haven't seen many international trips from either himself or the president throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, but he is in Jerusalem today, meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know if anybody else saw the ridiculous images of Secretary Pompeo arriving in Jerusalem, but he actually had this mask on of U.S. red, white, and blue stripes and stars. It was quite quite the image, so I hope people can check that out. But he really represents the right-wing evangelical forces in the United States that have inherited a really strong support for Israel, as support for Israel among progressive Jews and younger people in the United States is waning. You can find a whole host of polls over the last several years which show that a growing number of American Jews, for example, oppose illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, or that young Americans are starting to feel less comfortable with what they see correctly as this special relationship between Israel and the United States. And I actually feel as though Palestine as a cause and as an issue is on the ground, on the grassroots level, something that we're winning as a Palestine solidarity movement. I think even within more mainstream liberal circles, it's acceptable to criticize Israel because, thanks to Netanyahu, I would say, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the mask of Israeli apartheid has really been lifted. And that comes in the form of, for example, the national citizenship law, which is something that really many say set the stage for the annexation of the West Bank, a policy clearly that the Trump administration would like to help Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu further along, and really just making it clear that you can't support Israel as a Jewish state unless you are willing to support an apartheid state, one in which Palestinians don't have equal rights. And so the result of that, I think now, is exactly what we've led this discussion with, which is the recent appointment of Gilad Erdan to serve at the United Nations and in Washington as the ambassador to the UN and the United States. From what I've gathered, this decision came because Netanyahu, he was struggling to form a coalition government, and it looked as though some of his major opponents were going to actually pass a law in the Knesset and prevent him from serving another term because he's facing a corruption scandal. He's indicted. That's kind of all been affected by the outbreak of COVID-19. But in a way to get this coalition government formed, he agreed to let some of his major cabinet positions be held by opposition party leaders. And so one of the few appointments where he really wanted to make sure that he had a strong Likud figure backing him is apparently to the United Nations and the United States. This is the first time, I believe, since the 1950s that one singular Israeli official will be acting in both roles. And it really will be, I believe, the most important diplomatic role for any Israeli official, because at this point, for them to be sending Mr. Erdan, the Minister of Strategic Affairs, I hope Miko or someone else can discuss how this ministry was actually created as an intelligence unit, as a unit for the Israeli intelligence services to spy on BDS activists, boycott, divestmentization activists, and the Palestine Solidarity Movement worldwide as a whole. Essie did a great job of explaining how it really was an intelligence gathering operation. People in the United States were sending information to Israeli officials and reporting back on campus movements. This was all documented in the lobby, the documentary, which I'm sure we'll be discussing plenty, the Al Jazeera documentary, which exposed the inner workings of the Israel lobby in the United States and the UK. Gilad Erdan was running this operation, and now he's coming to the United States, and he will be working either under a second term of President Trump or perhaps under a Joe Biden administration, which I don't think would be so different from Trump on Israel. But this is going to be a major goal. I think the heavy hitter Netanyahu's putting out in what could be his last term as prime minister, though who knows, because he has a million lives, it seems. But this is the goal for them, is to win back the hearts and minds of the U.S. people, because it's really a battle they've lost over recent years, whether that's due to the Great March of Return, whether that's due to the series of bombing campaigns Netanyahu waged against Gaza, or just the fact that more and more under Netanyahu, Israel is lumped in with this group of strong men and kind of disliked, seemingly right-wing characters. And that's part of the reason why I think there's this kind of a break with the U.S. population between progressive forces, even some liberal forces. Remember, even Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar opted not to go to AIPAC this year because it's kind of the way that they have to nod and try and gain progressive support. I think that's a good sign, but I think we should be very concerned by what could happen under Gilad Erdogan's term in the United States.
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting. I don't remember when was the last time these two very, very important jobs of ambassador to the United Nations, which is posted in New York, and ambassador to the U.S. was united under one person. Oh, that's a lot of work. And yes, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. He was also the Minister of Homeland Security, Internal Security as well. There's probably an overlap there. They did, one of the Israeli TV channels did a major program about the BDS, what they call the BDS. They interviewed me as well. I was actually in Palestine, in Jerusalem at the time. And one of the things they showed was like the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and all the secret caches they have and the file cabinets that are, secured, and how everything is run exactly like this was, the war room, the CIA war room, if you will, kind of thing. Everything is done hush hush. Nobody would tell them what's inside this room or that room. And they were all very, very proud that it was all run like some major intelligence agency. This is very, very, I think it's a cause for concern for us, and it really shows that the shift has come now to the United States with the moving of this man to come here and work here in both of these important positions. Asa, you've been deeply involved or dragged maybe into the issue of the fall of Jeremy Corbyn and the accusations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There's a great interview that you gave. I think it was to the Grey Zone, if I'm not mistaken. I think the link is up there, in which you discussed that. You mentioned in the UK, in this leaked report that talks about what happened in the Labour Party and the fall of the Labour Party. It's interesting. I was in the UK for the last 3 Labour Party conferences. And at one point, I said something that resembles Estee's T-shirt at some gathering. There was a panel about free speech on Israel. I think there was a group within the Labour Party of mostly Jewish members, and they invited me to speak on a panel. And I listed, many of those things that are listed on that T-shirt together, including Zionism, and that became a big deal, comparing Zionism, to all these other things, which of course is not allowed. So would you tell us a little bit about your experience and also your thoughts in terms of what evidence do we have that actually pro-Zionist groups and perhaps even the embassy in London was involved in Jeremy Corbyn's political fall, if you will?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the panel, Miko. I would like to talk a little bit about the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and it is really key to this whole thing, as we've been talking about so far. Just to give a little bit of background for what the Ministry of Strategic Affairs is. I mean, it's a very kind of anodyne sounding, just it's a ministry. But I think Anya hit it exactly right to describe it as it's basically an intelligence agency. It's a semi-covert sabotage agency run by the Israeli government, and it operates around the world. And that's really the best way to describe it. So it was founded in 2006, Now, at first, it was kind of a ministry for Avigdor Lieberman, just to give him something to do as part of Netanyahu's coalition at the time, right? And in the early years, it was about Iran. It was about targeting Iran. It was about, basically ramping up Israel's international efforts against Iran to sabotage it and so forth. But in 2015, it was changed and it was reoriented towards the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. It was a way to sabotage, for Israel to work globally, primarily in the US and the UK and other Western countries, to sabotage and attack the Palestine solidarity movement, and especially the BDS movement, boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Now, sabotage and attack is not my hyperbole. Those are the words used by the Israeli planners. The Israeli think tank, the Reut Institute, which my colleague Ali Abu Nara talked about last week, a decade ago was recommending that Israeli intelligence agencies, quote, sabotage and quote, attack the BDS movement and Palestine solidarity efforts around the world. And the Ministry of Strategic Affairs really is the result of those recommendations and what it's been doing. So from 2015 onwards, it got this new mandate under Gilad Erdan, its then new minister at the time. And Gilad Erdan, as we've been talking about, who's now moving to the US to be this sort of dual ambassador. I think this is highly, highly significant news. So 2015 was the year that Gilad Erdan got this new mandate. 2015 was also the year that there was a transition in Israeli ambassadors in London. So it became Mark Regev. Mark Regev was sent to the UK as a new ambassador of London. So to London, a new Israeli ambassador to London. So Mark Regev, of course, is infamous to us as Palestine solidarity activists, as a propagandist for Benjamin Netanyahu. For years, he's been on our TV screens defending Israeli wars and massacres in various guises in the most outrageous terms that really even outrage liberal TV commentators in the UK. At least, and for that reason, I think we quite often saw rightfully saw Mark Regev as quite a right-wing figure, and of course he is, because in terms of Israeli politics, there's no left really. So but really, within the Zionist movement, he's considered to be a figure on the left. Actually, this is something we've missed about his background, and he was. It seems to me, was sent to London with the goal of disrupting and stopping the left, and to try and divide the left against itself, and to try and re-infiltrate Zionism into the left, and certainly into the Labour Party left. So in terms of the evidence, as has been mentioned, we've seen it in the Al Jazeera undercover documentary. So the key point is this: the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is essentially an intelligence agency, a sabotage agency for the Israeli government, works in close coordination, what they call coordination, with pro-Israel groups, with Zionist groups, Israel lobby groups, whatever you want to call them. They work in many of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs works in close coordination with many of these groups around the world in order to push its agenda, and it does that, and we've seen in these undercover documentaries really direct evidence of that. And so, first of all, in the lobby, with the first one, which was about the UK, so it exposed the activities of the Israeli embassy in the UK in infiltrating political parties in the UK. The result of that was that Shai Massot was expelled from the UK. Boris Johnson, who was a foreign minister at the time, had to make this sort of apology, but it was kind of swept under the carpet. So Shai Massot was, in my view, and I think there's very good evidence for this, and I've written about some of it in the past. Shai Massot was an agent for the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And what he was doing was trying to influence the Labour Party. He was working with pro-Israel groups within the Labour Party, with Israel lobby groups. He was trying to create new groups, supposedly grassroots groups that were actually astroturf. And we know that the Israel lobby and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs are doing the same thing in the US. So in the Lobby USA, the American follow-up by Al Jazeera's and Investigative unit, it showed many, many examples of this. So one of the most striking ones was that we had, Estes mentioned the Israel on Campus Coalition. Jacob Bain, the executive director on the Israel on Campus Coalition, in that other cover footage, privately admitted that his group coordinates with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and he stated that his researchers, quote, issue early warning alerts to our partners, unquote, including Israeli ministries, including the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So what that allows Israel to do is to use overseas groups to essentially spy on and sabotage and subvert democratic processes in the US, the UK, and other countries in order to promote its agenda. The most insidious part of this is that some of these groups then describe themselves as Jewish community organizations. So this is the most insidious part of it, because what the Israel lobby is trying to say is that, oh, well, we represent all Jews. So in a way, that is anti-Semitic. They're actually encouraging anti-Semitism, a form of racism that we all oppose and stand against, as we do all racism, because we're an anti-racist movement. But the Israel lobby deliberately tries to muddy the waters, and this was a big part of what led to the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, the use of Jewish or Jewish community, whatever. And then sometimes these groups are very small. Sometimes it's just a handful of people, but they're always representing the Jewish community somehow. And you see this everywhere. You're right. This is happening in many countries. Again, just a little anecdote. I was in Italy last year in Milan, and the lecture I was supposed to give at the university there fell on a Jewish holiday. And suddenly the university was informed by the Jewish community, which turns out to be a small Zionist group, that this was offensive and therefore they had to cancel the event. Thankfully, this was Italy, and the students just decided to occupy the campus, and the lecture went through, which was great. But it's always the Jewish community somehow, which of course means that if you oppose it or if you do anything to offend it, then you're anti-Semitic. So let's move on to the second question. What tactics, we really covered, I think, the evidence well. What tactics are being employed? Esty, what can you point to show what kind of tactics they're using on all levels? Because we know that they intervene even when it comes to city council elections and mayoral elections and so forth. So what tactics do we see that are being employed?
Well, they use carrots and sticks, and they're very smart about appealing to people on issues that they are meaningful. They, appeal to Jews by tapping into their fears about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and they appeal to white Christians through their guilt over the Holocaust, and they appeal to lawmakers by appealing to their nationalist and expansionist and imperialist tendencies. They offer free trips, not only to politicians and staffers, but also to college and university student office holders and artists and influencers. They do this all the way down, as you said, to city level, state level, city level. They do this for people in school board. I mean, school board elections is like where politicians start off, and it starts there. In fact, the chair of the California Democratic Jewish Caucus, California is the only state that has, our legislature has a Jewish caucus, and it's led by a guy who started his professional political career as on the school board, Santa Monica City School Board. They use promotions through false information campaigns, like, you know, pink washing, trying to paint Israel as this gay-friendly, you know, paradise. You know, they miss out saying, except or if you're Palestinian and gay. They do greenwashing to make themselves seem like they're, you know, this very environmentally aware state. They use campaigns targeting brown and Black progressive leaders in a very racist way, like Angela Davis and Mark Lamont Hill, Michelle Alexander and Linda Sarsour have all been, you know, pursued, targeted, demonized. Mark Lamont Hill lost a job very quickly. As I said, they thwarted the campaign of Keith Ellison, who was the overwhelming favorite of party members to become the chairman of the National Democratic Party, at the demand of the party, one of the party's top donors, Haim Saban, who didn't want a Muslim who was, you know, sympathetic to Palestinians running the party, said he would, you know, withhold his campaign donations. You know, the big thing is conflation campaigns that aim to change the definitions of words, like we've been discussing, you know, conflating anti-Semitism, and changing literally changing the definition of the word to include criticism of Israel. Intersectionality is one that they're going crazy over right now, because their argument is anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. So in order to make that legally binding, so they can really go after people with teeth, they need to redefine anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. Likewise, in order to make intersectional organizing sound sinister, they have to change the definition of intersectional. You know, this is what they do. They're terribly threatened by intersectional organizing. And so, you know, they say things like, there's actually a article on the cover story of the LA Jewish Journal titled "How Intersectionality Became a Sinister Threat to American Jewry." And it goes on and it, you know, tries to tell American Jews, Los Angeles Jews, how to think about this, you know, as, you know, a result of the flare-up from the women's marches, where you had leaders like Linda Sarsour there. The first women's march had a Zionist rabbi speaking, and yet, you know, they couldn't handle that Linda Sarsour was there, so they had to start attacking intersectionalism and redefining it in a way to make it, you know, anti-Semitic with lots of subtext and innuendo. And even last year, Reut, the Israeli organization, put out a report titled "How Intersectionality Poses a Threat to the Organized American Jewish Community." And the third, I think, you know, great conflation is that the greatest anti-Semitic threat in America is not from the left. Is from the left and not the right. And the Reut report, you know, goes into this saying, you know, how the head of Reut, that he was more concerned about anti-Semitism on the political left than he was with anti-Semitism on the political right, saying outrageous things like, on the right, it's much more about a challenge of physical insecurity, like what happened in Pittsburgh. But anti-Semitism on the left is more threatening in the sense that it is polarizing the Jewish community and drives a wedge between Jewish communal organizations and many young Jews, and as a result loses its vitality, which kind of brings us full circle to the beginning days of AIPAC, which was originally formed to interpret and explain to the American people things that the Israeli government was doing that they knew might not be okay to the American public and even American Jewry.
Yeah, you mentioned the definition of the new definition of anti-Semitism. There's this what's called the IHRA definition, And the IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and their new definition of anti-Semitism is something that has been pushed and accepted by governments and non-governmental agencies, political parties. I remember in the UK, there was quite an issue whether the UK Labour Party was going to accept it or not. Here at the University of California, there was a debate, and so on. So this is something that's suddenly, why does anybody need to change the definition of anti-Semitism? What was wrong was just racism targeting Jews. And of course, the problem was that it's not enough, because it's not about Jews, it's about Israel. It's not about Judaism, it's about Zionism. And the conflation that you talked about, of course, the biggest conflation is conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Because they obviously want to hide the fact that, you know, anti-Semitism is racism, anti-Zionism is a fight against racism, because Zionism is inherently a racist ideology, and of course they fear that. And another term that they now say is sinister is the word justice. If you speak about justice, then that is now some kind of code word for anti-Semitism, because justice for Palestinians means, you know, killing all Jews or getting rid of all the Jews in Israel and that sort of thing. That's kind of been their debate. And it's interesting. About a year ago, sometime last year, I noticed, I learned about this program that Israeli high school kids need to take before they go overseas on kind of student exchange programs. And so I signed up to take this program. It's an online program. And they've got all these, you know, well-known figures, important figures, government ministers, and, you know, things like that, discussing and explaining to kids all of these different issues. And one of the definitions they discuss, or one of the issues they discuss, is what is BDS? And this goes to what you said, Esty, about the problem with intersectionality, but the other side of the coin, because they said that BDS, they call it a red-green alliance. It's an alliance between extreme right-wing jihadist Muslim groups and radical, extreme, anarchist, communist left groups that have come together, created an alliance in order to kill Jews, an anti-Semitic alliance. And that's really all they understand. That's all they explain about BDS. That for them is BDS. So that's, you know, these are all very interesting things. Anya, I want to go back to you. You said earlier that it seems that on the grassroots level, we are winning. There is progress, yet we are seeing all these other things that all three of you discussed. And we're talking now about what tactics are being employed. So what tactics are being employed? What do you see?
Labeling is key. I believe Asa will have plenty to say about the way the anti-Semitism campaign in the UK was used to sabotage Corbyn. And I have no doubt that if Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, had been a more viable and serious opposition challenger to Joe Biden, if he'd survived more of the primary fight, essentially if the invisible hand of Barack Obama hadn't appeared behind the scenes and set the stage for Joe Biden to win the nomination, that this same campaign would have been spun against him, and that he would have been questioned about his more progressive surrogates, such as Ilhan Omar, for her comments about the Israel lobby, and really only because he didn't get as far as I think many of us would have liked to see. We didn't see that campaign roll out here in the same way. But other tactics employed by these interests include the surveillance and the intimidation that we already discussed when we brought up Gilad Erdan and the fact he's coming to the United States, this strategic affairs ministry and the surveillance of activists, U.S. activists in the United States. I think the greatest example of intimidation is the Canary Mission, the website which was essentially a hit list of college students, kids basically, who come to campus and are passionate about justice, as you say, Miko, and decide to get involved with Palestinian solidarity. And then the next thing they know, their picture and their biography and their personal information is on this site. It's really terrifying. I can't tell you how many younger students I met who talk about how weirded out and really scared they were when that first happened to them. A lot of them now wear it as a badge of honor. having been targeted by the Israel lobby like that. But that was, we of course don't know which organizations are coordinating necessarily with the Israeli intelligence agencies, but we know that the Israeli intelligence agencies are running these types of campaigns on US soil, and we don't even know how to keep track of the individuals participating in them. I mean, it's outrageous, especially as someone who worked for RT, and my employer was actually forced to register as a foreign agent, as an organization representing the interests of the Russian government, even though the BBC and Al Jazeera were never forced to do such as journalistic organizations. But neither are any of these people who are reporting directly to Israeli intelligence about the activities of US students. Nobody at AIPAC is forced to register as a foreign agent. That is just really bizarre to me. But the final point that I want to touch on, since we're talking about the way Zionist interests have really hurt progressive organizing and solidarity in the United States, it's a good opportunity to discuss something that I think for a long time was a touchy issue on the left, I know, especially in the United States. But it is really something significant that had an impact on anti-war organizing here, and that was the conflict in Syria. And I saw the damage that the debate over US involvement in Syria and the war on Syria, the damage that it really did to Palestinian solidarity organizing specifically. I've spoken with students all across the United States who come from Students for Justice in Palestine organizations from a whole host of universities, and they'll tell you how, for some reason, this issue really brought out a shift and a divide in solidarity organizing. And I witnessed it firsthand when, for example, my husband now and my partner at the time, Max Blumenthal, released a report at the Gray Zone talking about the White Helmets, this US-backed organization that was getting constant coverage in mainstream media to drum up support for more intervention in Syria. And as a result of his reporting and positions that he and Rania Khalek, another friend of mine, Ali Abunima, another giant in Palestine solidarity organizing, there are actually calls within Palestine solidarity to boycott the three of them, to not allow them to speak on campus because of the position they took on Syria. And they even successfully shut down some of Rania's events on college campuses, exactly in the way Zionist organizations do. These groups of students and activists who were in favor of continued US intervention in Syria ran the same kind of intimidation and censorship campaigns. And it didn't really make sense to me, as someone who came from years of anti-war organizing, someone who I participated in the Iraq War demonstrations. It was a clear line to me to oppose the US war on Syria, US support, Israeli support, Gulf support for armed groups in Syria. And I only think that those of us who stood up against those positions of our government have been vindicated, especially on the Israel issue, because what happened to the White Helmets in the end? Israel evacuated them out of Syria. And while the United States did not achieve its ultimate objective in Syria, which was regime change in Damascus, there was a significant outcome of the Syrian conflict, and it's very simple. Trump Heights in the Golan Heights. The United States would have never been able to take that step of recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel, if not for the war that the US and its allies had waged on the Syrian military for years. That was a direct outcome of the US war on Syria, and a lot of people in Palestine solidarity were actually on Israel's side in that, and that had a very damaging effect on the anti-war movement. Even major anti-war organizations, I don't want to get into the details because many of them have come together and gotten over this, were afraid to work with each other over the inner workings of this Syria conflict. And so it was really damaging, but I think now we've moved out of it and kind of seen where people fall, and that's why I think it's important to talk about it right now. But we should just be very clear that Israel benefited very, very much from that war, and that it did a lot of damage also to Palestinian solidarity.
So let me follow up on that for a second, Anya. I remember when the war in Syria just began, I gave a talk. I forget what city I was in, but at a big mosque. And when I came, the organizer apologized that half the mosque wasn't coming to my talk because even though they agree on the Palestine issue, there's a rift between him as the organizer and the others because of Syria. And that was the first time I heard that there was this rift in the pro-Palestine camp, in the Palestine Solidarity camp, because of Syria. And of course, like you described, it has grown to some really outrageous proportions. But do you tie that back to somehow intervention by Zionist groups?
I do believe that the tactics that these Zionist groups used against Palestine solidarity were then turned against people, turned it against themselves in Palestine solidarity. It was almost as though they had internalized the tactics of their oppressor. And who benefited the most in the end was Zionist groups. Palestine solidarity was so busy fighting over Syria that they couldn't even unite for the basic cause of Palestine, Miko. I mean, it's just shocking to me that people couldn't come together, even if they disagreed, to hear a talk about Palestine, right? Who benefits from that at the end of the day?
Yeah, that was a big rift. Asa, we're talking about the tactics, and I remember something. Like I said, I was at Labour Party conferences 2017, 2018. I was actually allowed to go in. 2019, they wouldn't allow me they wouldn't give me the pass. I think you were denied a pass as a journalist in 2019.
That's right.
Mistaken. But one thing I saw that was interesting, 2017, there was a big pro-Palestine presence in the main room, but there's also Labour Friends of Israel had a big booth. 2018, there was no Labour Friends of Israel presence at all, and inside the main hall, especially leading up to the leader's speech, which I was denied, but that's another story, to which I was denied entry. It looked like the whole conference looked like a big pro-Palestine rally. Everybody was carrying Palestinian flags.
Yeah, it was great.
It was incredible. But the fact that there was no presence for the Labour Friends of Israel worried me for some reason, because on the one hand, there was the pretense of this, yes, we won, all these pro-Palestine resolutions were being discussed and so forth. And then, of course, we saw what happened at the end of 2019 with a crash. I don't know if that was part of their tactic to just step away, let the people on the floor do whatever they want to do because they had a bigger agenda. There was something bigger that they were dealing with. But what do you see as their tactics?
Well, I think their tactics have been, especially when we're talking about the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the Israel lobby, and the left, and the wider solidarity movement, is division. That's what it comes down to. It's divide and rule. And it kind of does relate a bit to Anya's comments just now about Syria and the solidarity movement. I think we could probably have a whole panel, a whole discussion on that whole issue. Without going too much into that, I essentially agree with everything Anya just said. Like, I think it's been really divisive. But specifically about the pro-Israel organizations and their strategy for division, they specifically tried to do this. Like, this was set out in policy papers. Like, and it makes sense, right? Because this is something that empires and pro-imperialist movements have been doing from day one, right? So this is something, Zionism has always been a regressive, anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-progressive movement, like from the beginning, like right from the beginning of the history of Zionism. And it has always presented itself to policymakers, it's always sold itself to policymakers as something to get the left to something that will help them in their campaigns against the left, against socialist organizations, against communist organizations. And what pro-Israel organizations did in the Labour Party specifically was they came in and they very deliberately tried to create divisions. And this was something that we've mentioned the Reut Institute several times now, and they do have strong ties to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and their policies have been endorsed by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. I hope that an article that I'm going to refer to now will be, I'll just send it to Michael, hopefully he can put it through to the chat. But in this article, we talk about a Reut Institute report from 2017, where again, it relates to what Esty said about intersectionality. They're noticing the sort of wave and the rise of the analysis of intersectionality, where you try and work together to combat different forms of oppression. The pro-Israel organizations, of course, are seeing this as a threat, right? Because if, for example, Black Lives Matter protesters and the movement for Black Lives organizers and grassroots people start expressing solidarity, as they did in 2015 with Palestinians, then these groups end up working together, and that creates, from Israel's perspective, more of a threat to their systems of oppression. And in these strategy documents, they in their attack and sabotage documents, this particular one for 2017, they talk about the threat of intersectionality as well. And we saw these kind of tactics. So just to give one small example, in the UK Labour Party, we saw Joan Ryan, who was at the time the chairperson of Labour Friends of Israel. So she was an MP, a Labour MP from the right of the party, very anti-Corbyn all along, vehemently anti-Corbyn, and she was head of this pro-Israel lobby group. And we saw in the lobby, the first documentary, the UK documentary, she was caught basically on camera red-handed. Well, first of all, discussing £1 million of funding, £1 million of funding from the Israeli embassy for trips to occupied Palestine. These kind of under Israeli pro-Israel junkets, essentially, which it seemed like she was talking about MPs, but they later claimed it was students. It may have been, or it may have been both. But the point is, there was a lot of money going into this. Secondly, the thing she was caught on red-handed doing, which was the most shocking, although not surprising really, was essentially fabricating an anti-Semitic incident where there was a woman who came to the Labour Friends of Israel stand at the time, and she wanted to discuss the so-called two-state solution and so forth, and was challenging Labour Friends of Israel on their position and so forth. Joan Ryan wasn't able to answer the questions, and she ended up walking away. But then she went on to report this person who was a member of the Labour Party and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign to the party, essentially for anti-Semitism, alleged anti-Semitism, just because she talked about the fact that Labour Friends of Israel has influence in the Labour Party, which is just objectively true. You can debate on the level of the influence, and I would say that it's certainly declining, but it's there. There's no doubt that it's there. And she did more than that. She went to some of the newspapers, the anti-Palestinian newspapers like the Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle in the UK, and it created this whole ridiculous witch hunt about, there's anti-Semitism. Every year for the last few years at Labour conference has been hype about, anti-Semitism at the Labour Party conference. You look at the details, and it's actually as with it was done around you, Miko, as you've mentioned, and it was actually just criticism of Israel, criticism of Israel's official ideology, Zionism. So what this is attempting to do is to create division in the left. So people on the left who are maybe not that familiar with the issue of Palestine, the cause of Palestine, and the fact that the Zionist movement is a movement of oppression against Palestinians, they maybe have a weak understanding of Zionism and think, well, Zionism, Jews, we don't want to be anti-Jewish, just on this very weak level, with a shallow sort of level. And so therefore it's our task to show the truth that Zionism doesn't represent all Jews by any means. I suppose we're getting into the last part of the discussion now, more about what can we do to counter it. But I think this is their strategy, is to create division, to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and false allegations of anti-Semitism. In some circumstances, have been really quite successful in that way.
Yeah, there was, I was just reminded, all this talk about them working as an intelligence agency and the strategic affairs. I almost forgot, a couple of years ago in Jerusalem, and there was actually a conference on how to combat BDS. And I happened to be in Jerusalem, so I signed up and attended. I showed up there, of course, not knowing what to expect. It was a massive, massive conference.
Yeah, there's a lot of money that goes into these things. You can tell.
I couldn't believe. I mean, just the free food and just the thousands of participants, and they were former, Mossad operatives, and everybody from the president of the state of Israel, journalists were there. It was sponsored by the Yot Ahronot and Stand With Us and so on. One of the things that actually came up was, and this was said by the then minister, I believe, of Internal Security. It wasn't Erdogan, it was someone else, Katz, I think, that the Mossad has not yet, and Ali Abu Nima actually, and Ali Abu Nima and was one of the faces of the enemy, as well as Omar Barouti. And you'd think they were, God knows what, some, mastermind terrorists. And they very clearly said the Mossad has not yet used all the tools in its toolbox.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
To target and to get this done and to fight BDS. And those two faces, probably the two, most non-violent kind faces, if you know the people, would never resort to violence. And these were the faces of that were brought up. I think this is looking back now, it's really quite horrifying. And I remember when Jeremy Corbyn was, at the height of his political life as labor leader and so forth, I thought, they're not going to let this man become prime minister. There's no way they're going to how they're going to achieve it, where they're going to stop. In terms of tactics, it was hard to say, especially looking back at what was said in that conference. But clearly they found other ways to bring him down and to bring down labor.
Just one quick point on that. Just just to say that Joan Ryan, who I mentioned in that example of having fabricated this allegation of anti-Semitism, being caught on camera doing it. Also in the documentary, the cover footage, one of her employees, co-workers within Labour Friends of Israel, their full-time parliamentary officer, Michael Rubin, admitted that Joan will talk most days to Shai Massot. So he was saying that the Israeli embassy operative spy, who was sent packing after it was exposed in the film came out. So he's essentially saying, we say we're not Labour Friends of Israeli embassy, but actually we're kind of, not in so many words, he was saying, we're essentially a cutout front group for the Israeli embassy. So Joan Ryan was talking most days to the embassy, so it's not as if they're this independent organization that they make out they are. They do work very closely together.
I think what's coming out of this so far is that this is actually far worse, far deeper, and should be far more of much more concern to people in the US and in the UK in terms of the intervention, in terms of just how deep this intervention is. I was just remembering when I entered that conference a couple of years ago in Jerusalem. I didn't think anybody would recognize me, but you never know. And then as soon as I walked in, I suddenly hear somebody say, "Oh, look, there's Miko." And it was Dan Cohen and Anthony Lowenstein who were there, two great journalists, also who were there trying to hide away. And so the three of us stuck together, and it was really scary and shocking. And just going just real quick back, I'm looking at the chat here. There's some really good stuff. Helena Corbyn just posted something about what you said, Anya, about the Syria issue. And she had Max, and she did a whole series on the issue. And there's a link to the work, and they were discussing the Syria issue and what that meant to the Palestine solidarity team, or solidarity, groups. And there's a link there to that. But let's move on to the final question, which is really, how do we combat this? How do we tackle this? How do we expose this, I suppose, would one thing we should do. And then also, where do we go from here in terms of pushing this extremely important issue of Palestine and justice for Palestine forward, so that we do get to a point where we could have a Jeremy Corbyn prime minister? We could have, if not, hopefully somebody more progressive than Bernie Sanders, and less Zionist than Bernie Sanders, but still somebody who's willing, who's able and willing to say the things that need to be said, and then get into a position where they're actually able to change policy and affect things on the ground. So I'll start with you again, Esti. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, from what everybody's saying, we have to remember that fear is one of the tactics that they use. I was introduced into the movement by finding a wanted poster on my front doorstep about 3 months after I launched JVPLA. So, fear is what they use. And I think what we need to use to tackle this phenomenon is, one, we need to hold the media accountable. And there are ways to do that, by, consistently writing letters to the editor and op-eds, through the tactics of, going through the system by educating elected representatives and their staffers and developing relationships with them, being politely persistent. Of course, in most cases that needs to be accompanied by an outside campaign, either calling them out or pushing them publicly, sometimes supporting them when they're attacked as anti-Semites, depending on, what their positions are. But we also need to use the opportunities to expose the parts of the stories that the mainstream media leaves out. And obviously, publications like Electronic Intifada and the Gray Zone Project and The Intercept and Mondoweiss do this regularly. But for instance, Michael Flynn's case is in the news right now. It's a great time to bump up the fact that Michael Flynn had contacted the Russian ambassador during, December of 2016 as part of the Trump transitions team, their effort to halt the UN resolution holding Israel accountable at the request of Israeli officials after, it became clear to them that the Obama administration wasn't going to veto it. I think we need to keep pushing progressive elected representatives on Palestine to make sure that it remains on the slate of progressive issues, which it definitely is. We need to make sure, for instance, for organizations that are endorsing candidates, we need to make sure that there's a question about Palestine on every progressive organization's endorsement questionnaire. We need to look into, exactly, what happens when, and expose what they do. Just last month, just in late April, the Platform Committee for Nevada's biggest county, Democratic committee in Clark County, had approved a platform that included 3 planks in support of Palestinian rights. They were put forth by Bernie Sanders delegates who basically, had the majority, and they called to end the blockade of Gaza. One supported the right of return, one to repeal the anti-boycott legislation, which Nevada is one of 27 states that have passed, which are unconstitutional. And yet hours after the platform was published, it was party leaders acted to strip the planks out of the platform. And so we have to get involved in these things. It's not for everybody, but by getting involved in, local politics and by getting on these committees like the folks in Clark County did, is where we gain power within the system to have an inside game as well as an outside game fighting against. Somebody had put in the chat, talk about, what happened when AIPAC attacked Bernie, and, they were smart. They knew that if they attacked him for being progressive, that it wouldn't be, that they wouldn't buy them anything. So they insidiously put, these huge ad campaigns, social media campaigns, talking about, how old he is and his health, what about his health? And, try to, get into the heads. I have to assume they were enormously frustrated by the large number of young Jews that were part of the Bernie campaign, to the point that in cities across America, Jews for Bernie, little confabs, were popping up and beginning to link together and work together. So yeah, I think education. And when we think that public officials know what they're talking about, I promise you, they don't. We need to educate them.
I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm seeing here also, look at the chats. I see some comments, great comments here from, Daniel, a friend from Spain, and Barbara from Milano, people that I've been in touch with. There's another, I think another important thing that is required. You touched on that, Esther, a little bit. We need to change the story. One of the comments here by Barbara, this issue of that they always claim that Israel is a democracy, and the proof is that, look, there are Arabs in the Knesset. And the story of the joint list right now is an interesting one, because really it's the only functioning political party in the Knesset right now, because they're not vying for seats and power. They're just getting things done. So they're really doing some really good work. But people are forgetting that the even though they are the third largest bloc in the Knesset, and even though they had really a remarkable rise in their strength in the last election, 15 seats is something nobody would have imagined they could possibly ever have. Their voice doesn't count because of the way the Knesset works, because of the way Israeli politics works. And so the fact that they're there, if anything, is only one more symptom to the fact that Israel is an apartheid regime and Palestinians don't have a voice, even when they do vote, because they could have double the number of seats in the Knesset and still be ignored, which of course they are largely, even though they do excellent work, and nobody's ever going to sit with them because they're Arabs, even if they do have mutual interests. So changing the story, taking all these claims that they put out there and changing the story and putting it out in a way that, of course, is more truthful, I think is really, really important. And I know, Anya, you've been reporting and working on issues that are tough and unpopular, and you've been doing it, I have to say, really courageously. Whether again it's Palestine or Venezuela, but how do we move these important issues forward? You were talking about Palestine. How do we move it forward? How do we tackle this reality where all of this, all these resources and all of this work is being done to shut down basically this topic, and how do we move beyond that?
I think it goes back to the point I made at the beginning, which is I truly do believe we are winning this debate on the grassroots level, and even likely within both parties. I think there's, among the average US person, more of an awareness of the special relationship the United States has with Israel and more of a critical view of it. And that's supported by polls and numbers that we actually see. And so we need to have the confidence of a winning movement. Everything that Esty mentioned makes total sense. She is very effective and understands more than I do how to actually move political figures. But I think the point, I'm so glad, Esty, that you brought up, for example, the case of Michael Flynn, which is all over media this week. Michael Flynn, the national security advisor for Trump, was the first casualty of Russiagate, what we've spent the entirety, or I should say what our mainstream liberal and corporate media establishment has spent the entirety of the Trump administration ramping up, believing that for somehow the Trump administration and Trump himself were actually controlled by Russia. And the first individual they pinned this theory on was Michael Flynn, because of this conversation he had with the Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak. I was at court the day Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to charges. And I remember reading the charge sheet and my jaw dropped and I was like, this is amazing. He had a conversation with the Russian ambassador on behalf of Zionist interests behind him, essentially Jared Kushner, saying, we would like it if you veto this resolution at the United Nations condemning illegal Israeli settlement activity, because we know the Obama administration is going to take this amazingly courageous step and not vote on the resolution for the first time in US history, but that, you know, if Russia can step forward and veto this resolution, it would be great. Which anybody who understands something about Russian diplomacy, if Michael Flynn was a Russian agent, I mean, that just shows you right there that he knew nothing. And also the arrogance to think the United States could influence Russia on behalf of Israel. When I read that indictment, I was thinking, Russiagate is actually Israelgate. Of course, nobody will talk about that, but I think the more we talk about it, the better, because it really is remarkable. It's right there in this huge mainstream story that's getting endless amounts of coverage. Israeli pressure on US officials. It really sums it all up. But as for what else we can do to combat these interests, I think there's two things. There's what we do between ourselves and what we do with public officials. And on the public official front, I think at this point there is no excuse for anybody branding themselves as a progressive to take any position other than critical of the special relationship with Israel and opposed to any initiatives really that AIPAC and its lobbies put forward. That's why I was so disappointed last week to see reports that Ilhan Omar, someone who's been held up as one of the most progressive members of Congress, actually signing on to an AIPAC letter, a position which is to, and it's actually a Trump administration position, to force the UN to implement an arms embargo on Iran. This is, I sent a link to the group, actually. It was in Al Monitor and a few other outlets. And her office actually responded saying that because there was nothing they opposed in the resolution, they couldn't refuse to sign it, even though it was an AIPAC initiative. Come on. The U.S. is not in any position to implement an arms embargo on Iran, especially if it's not in the same effort trying to implement one on Israel or Saudi Arabia. Absolutely ridiculous that anybody calling themselves a progressive would sign on to that letter, and I think she should be held accountable for that. AOC as well, she's the squad kind of representing this new generation of progressive voices, and now people are kind of waking up to the fact that she is willing to play the game of the corporate Democrats. She, for example, said that she didn't believe Tara Reade, the woman who stepped forward and accused Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her. She also voted for the first round of the corporate bailout that came as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we should remember the first signal she gave that she was willing to walk back some of her more progressive positions was on Palestine. She ran a campaign speaking about occupation, and then the minute she won, the first interview she gave, she was questioned by a reporter very lightly about her position on Palestine, and she backed away and said, "Oh, I'm not an expert on this subject." And that should have been a sign. It was for me that if you're going to sell out the Palestinians the minute you win an election, you can't be trusted as a progressive warrior. Who are you going to sell out behind closed doors if that's what you're willing to do in front of my face? I'm not saying that we should give up on her entirely, but they have to be pushed. Even Senator Sanders was asked during one of these presidential debates, or the Democratic debates, whether he would move the embassy back to Jerusalem, or back to Tel Aviv, I'm sorry, out of Jerusalem, and he wouldn't give a clear answer. He wouldn't just say, yes, absolutely, that is international law. I mean, it should be very simple, but apparently it wasn't for him. I found that to be disappointing. And I'm a little turned off by this narrative that Sanders put forward in that answer, which I hear a lot, which is that Netanyahu is, well, first he was saying Netanyahu, he was speaking as though Israel was so bad and right-wing and terrible because Netanyahu is the prime minister. Miko, I would love for you to comment because anybody who knew anything about Israeli politics at that time would not be looking at the situation and saying Benny Gantz would be any better for Palestinians if he were to take over as prime minister. But they don't only do this tactic of making Netanyahu represent Israel, but they also tie in Israel with all of the other governments and countries in the world that we don't like or that we think are human rights abusers. He says, I'm not friends with Putin in Russia. I'm not friends with Modi in India. I'm not friends with, I think he threw in Daniel Ortega at some point, or he had in the past, Nicaragua, maybe not in that specific answer, or Hungary, Viktor Orban. And I think that's just a really simplistic way of viewing the world. No country, perhaps other than Saudi Arabia, but no country enjoys the level of special relationship that Israel does with the US government. And nobody is really calling for the restructuring of the entire state the way that the Palestine solidarity movement is when it comes to Israel. Nobody's calling for boycott and divestment and sanctions on India. At least I'm not. I would be opposed to that. The only reason that we support boycott, divestment, and sanctions being this tool that I'm completely opposed to. I've dedicated most of my career right now to opposing sanctions on Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Iran. But why do we actually support sanctions on Israel? It's because we need to dismantle the entire state. It's an apartheid system. It's a unique situation. It's uniquely evil. It's uniquely backed by the United States. And so that's why we support this very unique tool in terms of opposing it, something which successfully broke down an apartheid state before in history. And so we should avoid lumping in Palestine with all of these other states. There's a reason that we're targeting it the way that it is, but we at the same time should also remember and be steadfast in the belief that Palestine isn't an island. It is part of a regional policy of the United States, and it's ultimately an extension of US and European colonial and imperial interests in the Middle East. And so if we view Palestine and Israel as part of that puzzle, then we're less likely to get bogged down in these very damaging debates, divide and conquer debates that want to split some people off for opposing US intervention in Syria, because it really all fits together. And we should defend each other when we're attacked unfairly, such as Asa, such as Ali, all of these people who I think when they're attacked, it only serves Zionist interests. And if we act united and we act confident and very clear in our view of Israel as a uniquely destructive and illegal apartheid state, but also that one that serves a very clear purpose as a tool of US empire and control in the region, then we can combat it on the personal level, and then also on the more political and powerful level when we're confronting even progressives who aren't willing to take brave positions on Palestine.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That was brilliant, Anya. Thank you for that. You really summed it up well. I love your comment to have the confidence of a winning movement. I think that's put on a t-shirt. Because a lot of people who are on with Palestine solidarity already walk around like they've lost, and so what's the point, of getting up in the morning?
Or that they're afraid to stand strong or stand next to someone who's being attacked.
And that's one of the comments here again. A friend from Liverpool, Jack, is saying, well, if they did this, people are afraid. And somebody else here from the U.S. also made the comment, well, if they're doing this to famous people, if they're doing this to Corbyn, if they're doing this to Mark Lamont Hill and Angela Davis, then what am I going to do to me, who's I'm just a kid in college, or I'm just an activist at a church or wherever, and then think of what kind of damage they can do to me. And people are afraid. And your comment about Sanders is right. He has this little preamble. He goes, "I'm very proud to be Jewish and I support Israel," as though being Jewish and supporting Israel is somehow connected. Being Jewish is one thing, supporting Israel is supporting racism. And you summed it up, I think, really, really well.
Or supporting Netanyahu. I think that's really dangerous.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. You know, Netanyahu, if we look at every single prime minister and every single government since Israel was established, Netanyahu is the natural successor to all of them. In other words, there's no break here. Netanyahu is not unique. From Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister, all the way through to today, and if Benny Gantz ever becomes prime minister, or anybody else for that matter, because it doesn't look like Netanyahu is ever going to give up that seat, there is no difference, because these are the natural successors to a racist ideology, to a racist state, to Zionism, and so forth. So Asa, I want to turn to you. You know, talking about how do we move forward in the UK? I saw two things. One, I remember Jewish people within Labour created JVL, Jewish Voice for Labour, which is kind of like a progressive Jewish movement within Labour. And then Chris Williamson has his Festival of Resistance, which perhaps is a sign of some a reason for optimism. What is your take on how we move forward and how we push this agenda to where we want it to be?
I think the key to all of this is, and as the other we've all been saying, really is solidarity. That's got to be the main fight back, really. I mean, it's the point Chris made last week. You know, how do we counter all of this? To answer your hypothetical Labour member who's kind of, or Palestine Solidarity member who's worried about, well, you know, they've done this to Jeremy Corbyn. They were even trying it with Bernie Sanders. They've done this to famous people. What can I do? Well, the point is they can pick us off one by one, but they can't defeat all of us. And we, you know, the thing is that Corbyn didn't really try. That's the thing. That's why he was defeated. He didn't.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your interview. You were quite critical of his response to this.
Yeah, you know, he's a nice bloke, but he didn't try. He never tried to defeat the Israel lobby. He really pandered to them, really, because he didn't. You know, I'm not going to just sit here and be more radical than now and say he was a sellout and all this kind of stuff. No, it's not. The fact is, he didn't. Even when the film The Lobby came out, he didn't do anything to stop the pro-Israel groups doing what they were doing. And so if he didn't try, then you can't say that you couldn't succeed if you did try. You know, I mean, the point is when there's solidarity, we all stand together. They can't defeat us. And what you mentioned earlier about all those Palestinian flags at the Labour Party conference was a good example of that. That was a really great illustration of how isolated the Israel lobby really is within the Labour Party, within the left, within wider progressive movements, you know, because accompanying that display of the flags and so forth, the point of that was that it was to raise morale. It was an initiative by the Palestine Solidarity Camp, and it gave out all these flags. And it was to raise morale at the 2018 conference to build support for the motion, which called for, without specifically naming BDS, because they were being overly cautious. In my opinion, they were being overly cautious not to mention specifically BDS. But it was to essentially have elements of BDS, to have an arms embargo. If a Labour government came in, it would end arms trade with Israel, which is an important element of BDS. And you know, if it was enacted, could have a massive impact. So for 2 years running, Labour Party conferences overwhelmingly passed these motions saying a Labour government, if it came into power, would end the arms trade with Israel. I mean, that's historic. That is massive. I mean, again, even if, of course, Corbyn didn't come to power, we don't have a Labour government, so there's that. But even if he had, there's a question of whether it would have been implemented, because it was just it was conference policy. It wasn't official from the top of the Labour Party. But it was important, you know, it was because it built this grassroots support. And again, it's another example of what we've been saying. We have the grassroots. We are the grassroots. And we're winning on that level. And it was historic, again, because the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, was really in the words of one historian, large parts of it in the 30s and the 40s was Zionism plus plus. That's what, they were more Zionist than the Zionists in a lot of ways, because they wanted. There was one famous Labour Party politician who became a minister in the 1945 government. This great reforming government built the welfare state, built the NHS, but it was imperialist. It was literally running an empire, the British Empire at the time, and he wanted to have a Jewish state in Libya as well as in Palestine. So it was to expand the so-called Jewish state even that far. So there were some real extremists in the Labour Party. So for the Labour Party grassroots to pass these motions in favour of essentially BDS, of an arms embargo, and even last year to call for the right of return for Palestinian refugees, is massive. Yeah, we're missing our own victories. We don't have enough confidence in our own victories. That it's huge. It's huge, and we really need to build on that. So I think if we stand together, it doesn't matter what the dirty tactics; they can be defeated. Yeah,
and it's what I said when I opened. We were very close. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was just a few thousand votes away from becoming prime minister.
Yeah, in 2017.
And that's enormous to have somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, with his positions on all issues, but particularly on Palestine, to come that close to becoming prime minister, and that would have been a game changer. As you said, I agree. And last week also, Ali talked about the importance of holding their feet to the fire. So in other words, even after they're elected, even after they are in power, to hold their feet to the fire. We didn't vote for them, I think he said, to be my best friend or my aunt or uncle, but to serve us and to serve the interests that we believe in.
Yeah.
I think we wrapped this up quite nicely. I mean, you guys, I have to say, this is fantastic. The stuff that's coming out here today. And there's some great comments here on the chat. But I think we should open it up now for Q&A. So Jamil, if you're there and you've got the questions, let's go ahead and start.
Yeah, sure thing. So we got a lot of questions. Let's try to get through as many as we can. So question number one, this one's from David. What is the mechanism used by the various Israel lobbies that were used to derail Bernie Sanders, including Bloomberg's entry in the presidential race and the resources he gave to the Democratic Party during and after his presidential bid, along with the Democratic majority for Israel? I don't doubt that Bloomberg is an ultra-Zionist, but how does his media empire rate in regards to its objectivity towards Palestine and Israel? So I think David's talking about Bloomberg News and Bloomberg TV and that kind of thing as well.
Let's just go around. Esty, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Bloomberg News, but definitely, Bloomberg was part of the play. I mean, from early on, he said that he got in and that his treasure trove, that he was building an infrastructure that whether he was the candidate or not would be handed off, except if it was Bernie Sanders. So, giving Americans, Democrats, members of the Democratic Party, this belief that, so we'll have unlimited resources to win a campaign unless it's Bernie Sanders. I think that, that was disgusting, but I think that, they used all their, all their tools in their kit. Like I said, trying to target young people because it was the base of, Bernie's campaign. I think that, trying to, very, very, slyly attack him and use social media against him in ways that, weren't, calling him out for his progressive policies as much, but really, to sow seeds of doubt in the campaign, in his rhetoric about him, about his ability, to be healthy and to take the office, should he win the election.
Anya, what are your thoughts?
I think we covered some of the ways that Zionist organizations and the tactics they use to silence politicians and activists. And on the issue of Sanders specifically, I think it goes back to what I said about the movement for Palestine solidarity being a winning movement. Excuse me, I'm having a runny nose because of allergies. I just had to take care of that. But it's a winning movement, and it's also a generational issue in the same way that the progressive movement in the United States is winning overall, and there's this new excitement that was seen behind Bernie Sanders to support a wide spectrum of progressive policies, that Palestine is part of that new generation. If that generation, if the movement, regardless of Sanders, because as we've said several times, I think he's even less progressive than we would have liked to have seen. But if that movement Sanders represents were allowed to rise in the Democratic Party, Palestine would win as a result of that. And so the suppression of the Sanders campaign, led by just the establishment wing of the party, particularly former President Obama, who we know was the one who made phone calls to Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, encouraging them to drop out and build this coalition of neoliberal, old-style Democrats behind Joe Biden to crush Sanders. That action by the old wing of the Democratic Party is what crushed the Sanders movement. And so keeping the momentum alive behind the movement as a whole and as a movement beyond Sanders, I think will be key to bringing Palestine and justice for Palestine, Palestinian solidarity to halls of power in the United States. It's going to be a long and difficult fight, but we have to be aware of the tricks they're rolling out against us, such as using someone like Barack Obama in order to silence the progressive wing. And we just need to be strong and confident and believe that we're going to win.
Yeah, Asa, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree that with what both panelists said. I think Anya's right that Sanders's defeat was more about the establishment media and the sort of neoliberal establishment of the Democratic Party, rather than the Israel lobby and Zionist organizations per se. I think they were certainly involved, but I don't think we saw them really ramp up the full campaign.
They didn't have to.
Yeah, exactly, right. It did. I think you were right what you said earlier, that if he had received the nomination, had the political circumstances been different, we would have really seen it gone into overdrive. And I and others were writing about this been saying that for a while, and the response was often that, oh well, Bernie Sanders is Jewish, so therefore they won't be able to do that, it won't work. And I was never convinced by that. I think that and the reason for that is that the so-called anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party was never about anti-Semitism. It was never about genuine anti-Semitism. It was about defeating the left, and it was about defending Israel. Simple as that. So they would have done the same thing.
And they targeted so many Jews in the UK Labour Party. Half the people were suspended were Jewish.
Exactly.
Ask Miko if being Jewish prevents you from being labeled an anti-Semite.
Exactly. And
they have a new term. They call it auto-anti-Semite. They have a new term.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, again, like Jewish Voice for Labour that you mentioned before. Most of those activists, Jewish activists, were targeted in the so-called anti-Semitism crisis smear campaign. But they would have ramped it up, and it was about creating division, and that's what we did see. Small elements of it, early signs of it. With the squad, AOC, her kind of weakness, and early, as Anya mentioned, early signals on the issue, and even in veiled attacks on Ilhan Omar for her comments about the Israel lobby, saying that there is an Israel lobby and it uses money to try and influence politicians. It's an objective fact. It's a reality. The Israel lobby does do that. AIPAC uses dark money to try and influence politicians. It is just a reality. Again, something that was shown in the Israel lobby documentary. So it's about creating division. They don't have anything else. They have no positive vision.
Yeah.
And no one is actually anti-Semitic. Who they're attacking as being anti-Semitic. It's not a real issue.
In fact, a lot of the people doing the attacking actually on the right are very anti-Semitic. And, you know, President Trump says anti-Semitic stuff all the time to rooms full of Jews.
Yeah.
And, you know, they all forgive him and vote and give him.
Yeah, as a president who literally called neo-Nazis, you know, openly anti-Jewish neo-Nazis, marching that, you know, saying that Jews will not replace us, say they're very fine people. And at the same time, he's embracing these Israel lobby groups and they're embracing him. And you know, at best, they're offering very muted, tame criticisms of his language.
Yeah. You know, I see there's a comment here by Tony Greenstein, who is one Jewish member, he was a Jewish member of Labor who was attacked a lot, in fact. And he's saying we are all anti-Semitic because they were able to get the new definition of anti-Semitism. And I remember speaking to somebody in the Jewish labor movement, or whatever they're called, the Zionist group within labor. And, you know, they referred to that quite confidently, saying, well, here, this is the definition. And so obviously these people are anti-Semitic because this is the new definition of anti-Semitism that we go by. Jamil, should we move on?
Yeah. So this next question is from Anthony. The question is, I've seen reporting in the Grey Zone Project about British military intelligence running propaganda operations against its own population, including targeting Corbyn during the recent election. How can populations possibly defend themselves against intelligence services, which are reportedly running psychological operations against their own people to influence elections like this? Does British intelligence work with Israeli intelligence against the minds of its own people?
Anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah, I could come into that. I think those are really good questions, and I think it's a difficult one. How can we possibly defend ourselves against this seemingly, you know, insurmountable power of the state? It's difficult. I'm reminded of the example of the Black Panthers in the 60s and the 70s. The Black Panthers had the entire might of the American state attack them on all levels. The FBI would do things like they would actually fabricate letters. I read about at least one instance of this where letters between a fake letter ostensibly from one Black Panther Party chapter being sent to another Black Panther Party chapter on the other side of the continent, you know, denouncing the other chapter in order to foment and, you know, to foment this kind of internal feuds and to get people to fall out with each other. And I think we have seen it is likely that there have been, you know, 21st century equivalent versions of that, you know, being fomented and probably by British intelligence services. I think it's that kind of intervention has been done. If it has been done a lot more subtly than the Israeli intervention that has been done, because that's often been quite open. But how can we defend ourselves against it? I think it's hard. I think it's to just be aware of the reality of historical realities like that it does happen, and to try and create solidarity and to say, okay, well, you know, this person's being accused of anti-Semitism, and don't just take the course that some people on the left, unfortunately, in the UK have done, which is their first position is, okay, well, we have to believe that. Well, you know, you don't actually, because you have to look at the facts. There is such a thing as objective reality. So you can actually find that out. You know, it's the facts actually do matter. You know, it's not all about perception.
And, you know, it goes back to the point you made earlier, Asa, about solidarity. You know, the Black Panthers and what was done by the FBI to the Black Panthers is a great example. There's a great book about the murder of Fred Hampton and you know, the actual murder and the FBI policies that led to his to his assassination. And then the story that I wrote about in my book Injustice, the Holy Land Foundation, and what is being done today in America to Muslims all across the country. The intelligence services are all over it. They're Homeland Security and the FBI and who knows who else is out there in the mosques, in the Muslim community, and everybody is scared. So if we do not stand up when it happens to these other groups, then of course it's going to end up happening to everybody else. So I think
that light is the best disinfectant, as the saying goes, right?
Absolutely.
So I quite often just assume that my emails could be read, right? So at the end of the, we all have secrets, right? We all have our own personal lives and so on and so forth. But at the same time, at the end of the day, what we are what we say we are, right? We are for freedom, equality, and justice for everybody, you know. Yeah. And we're not called a small point on what Anya said earlier about sanctions and being against sanctions, but being in favor of it in the case of Israel. We're not calling for, you know, sanctions on medicine to Israeli babies. You know, we're not calling for food supplies to be, you know, stopped to Israel. We're calling for governments to sanction the Israeli arms industry, you know, and that is what BDS and things like that, you know, strategic, ethical, anti-colonial BDS, you know, it's an ethical version of sanctions. It's not a state sanctions, it's popular sanctions. We're calling for our governments to end those, their complicity with Israeli colonial apartheid. And that's how it's different.
That's how Chomsky always got out of supporting BDS. He would say, I don't support sanctions.
Yeah, it's a silly technical point.
Another point, since I think this question came from somebody in the UK, you know, where's the support for Julian Assange? You know, how come there are not hundreds of thousands of people out there every day demanding his release? So if we don't stand up when this is happening to other people, then it's going to keep to continue to happen. But Julian Assange is probably another great, excellent example of what happens when good people stay silent and we allow the government to take over and treat, you know, somebody who's a comrade the way Julian is being treated.
On that note, we also have to, you know, out organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is still, you know, government authorities and organizations go to them thinking that, you know, their assessment of how many anti-Semitic incidents there are, you know, is legitimate, when literally if Anya or I go to a college campus, or Miko, and give a speech about BDS, they mark that down as an anti-Semitic incident in Southern California or whatever state. And really, going back to like the Black Panthers, they were a spy agency working for government, and we need to get these stories out there and this history out there. And, you know, there are other organizations, anti-racist organizations, doing wonderful work, and the ADL has to be outed and taken off. Yeah. And these other organizations need to become, you know, the authorities who we look to in times when we need information about, you know, racist activities in America.
Yeah. All right, good question. Go ahead, Jamil. Let's go, keep going.
Okay, I have a good follow-up question for what was just discussed, actually. This one is from Nancy. So how do progressives unite to better inform and educate people about how imperialism is against our interests and must be crushed? How do we move people forward? Our organization, so this is Nancy talking about her org, was attacked by Zionists as far back as the 70s, when Zionists went into the African-American community in North Philadelphia and snatched down our posters exposing South Africa's ties with Israel.
Wow. Go ahead, anybody, just go ahead and jump in, guys.
I'm always really interested to talk about how US imperialism is bad for all of us. So thank you for this question. As I said earlier, while we have to recognize the unique special relationship with Israel and Israel's unique character, the fact it's an apartheid state, we also have to see it as part of a greater puzzle, as part of a tool and a legacy of European and US colonialism and empire. And if we view it as an issue that doesn't just exist out on its own, but actually fits into a wider picture, then we don't get stuck in these very damaging debates such as Syria. We understand how Syria fits into a wider narrative about Israel and about Palestine. But when it comes to convincing people why US imperialism is bad for all of us, I always like to tell people here in the United States that they might be surprised that when I go to places such as Venezuela, for example, one of the primary targets of US empire and financial restriction, economic terrorism really is what the Iranian foreign minister always says to characterize US sanctions. It is a targeted weapon against health systems, against food supplies, all of those things which Asa mentioned. But people in those countries understand that in some ways, and I believe this, the first victims of US empire are the US population, is the US population, the people here who are striving and fighting for all of these great, shiny promises made by someone such as Senator Bernie Sanders, healthcare, education, all of these benefits and just basic rights, human rights that other developed countries, people in other developed countries have access to, and which for some reason we don't get here in the United States, the richest country to ever exist in the history of the world. Well, why is that? It's because the United States is sending billions of dollars to Israel, and it has been for years, because it's spending exponential amounts of money on its ever-growing military budget. The only thing Congress can seem to get together and pass every year is the budget, which is largely earmarked for military spending. It's because the United States government is only interested and investing in a growing occupation of the world with its military and with its allies, that the public here is deprived of basic human rights, healthcare, the right to even, there are so many things we could do with the money and the wealth in this country, but because our government only serves a small elite, an elite which come from industry and capitalist interests, that's essentially the definition of imperialism, is when the government is only acting on the interests of that small elite and then using the wealth of the country to go and occupy the rest of the world in a quest for a never-ending quest for resources and wealth. And so Sanders didn't actually do a great job, I think, of making that connection between foreign policy and domestic policy. You can talk about healthcare all you want, but unless you're willing to have the conversation about where our money is going and why and how we confront that, we're not going to get those social programs that we all need here. And so that's why I see US imperialism is damaging to all of us. I think the public here is truly the first victim of that empire.
Anybody else want to jump in, or should we move on? All right, Jamil, go ahead.
Okay. This next one is from Nadia. The question is, could the Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs be prosecuted in the United States for interference in American politics? So this is a question about legality, but I chose it because it's also an interesting question about perhaps how slippery these types of organizations can be in terms of like how they present themselves and influence things.
That's actually a really good question. It's not something I've thought of very much before. I'm not a lawyer, but I will say I think that's a good idea. I mean, the thing is, it could obviously. I mean, I'd like to hear from our comrades at Palestine Legal about that. I'm sure they'd have thoughts about it. Especially with Gilad Erdan coming to the US, it could be a good opportunity. I think that even if it wasn't successful, you could such a case, you know, if it was properly done, you could potentially learn a lot about how Israel operates. You know, with discovery and so forth, documents and new evidence could be brought to light. And I think certainly from a journalist's point of view, I'd love to see what came out of such a case.
I'm not a lawyer either, and so I'm not sure how you could go after an Israeli ministry in U.S. courts. But one question I do have, which I mentioned earlier, would be if journalists from a foreign media outlet are supposed to be registered as foreign agents, or were forced to register as foreign agents, I don't see why there shouldn't be a case made that people working for AIPAC should have to register as foreign agents in the United States. And we should also know there should be an investigation into who is truly collaborating with these organizations which work out of the Israeli Strategic Affairs Ministry, which we spoke earlier, that are actually running surveillance and propaganda campaigns against U.S. citizens on U.S. soil and reporting back to a foreign ministry. Those people should probably be pointed out and made to register as agents of a foreign government.
I'm also not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure, just looking at cases that have been brought against individuals representing other countries, that it's legally probably possible. The idea is, when would we have somebody in government who would be willing to do it? I mean, Anya and Miko, you guys live in Washington, D.C., you know that, it's not a secret that actually when Israeli officials come to D.C., people know they're being spied upon. It's not a secret. So I think that there's, because they act with impunity, because they act fearlessly, nobody will ever, back to the USS Liberty, the US never went after Israelis for their crimes, the American government.
Rachel Corrie
is another great example, that, I think they just feel like, that nobody would have the chutzpah to do it.
Yes, but at the same time, they went after AMP, they went after CARE, they went after Holy Land Foundation, they went after all these Muslim organizations because somebody claimed that there was an attack by Palestinians against some Jewish settler and that they are somehow responsible. So that did go to, they actually went to court and, had to spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort and so forth. And I think in one case there was actually a judgment was given. So
right now the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights has been sued.
So so the legal argument, that's the answer. It can happen, but you have to be politically aligned and not in favor with the powers that be. You should be out of favor with the government. And then, if you're a Muslim, a Palestinian, Arab, then of course there's no problem. The courts will take it. That's the reality here. So I suppose theoretically it could happen when there is the kind of political shift that will allow it to happen. Go ahead, Jamil.
So, okay, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark. So we want to do one more? We want to be respectful.
Let's do one last one, and then we'll finish.
Okay, cool. We'll end on Jonathan's question then. So the question is, speaking of the UK, should we be representing this racket as an attack on the left/socialism, or an attack on the whole country, the integrity of its people and institutions, and national sovereignty? In this regard, I can't help note that the most effective political campaign we have seen in recent years is the one for Brexit, which wrong-headedly and divisively presents the EU as undermining British sovereignty.
I think that
good question.
I think historically and in recent history, there's no doubt that Zionism as a movement has absolutely presented itself as, it presents itself as an anti-left-wing or movement. From the beginning. Going right back to Herzl in the 19th century, before the British overtook Palestine during the First World War, occupied Palestine and began to hand it over to the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl wanted to see, like other Zionists, wanted to see a European power, essentially a European colonial power, give them influence and to help them to build a Jewish state in Palestine against the wishes of the indigenous people. And he had discussion in the late 19th century with the German Kaiser at the time, trying to persuade him to use his influence with the the Turks, with the Ottoman Empire at the time, which of course had control of Palestine at the time. It was within the Ottoman Empire, and Herzl was attempting to use his. He was trying to persuade the Kaiser to, persuade the Sultan on his behalf and on behalf of the Zionist movement. And what they were offering, as part of their argument to persuade the German Kaiser at the time to do this, was that Zionism was a movement that would keep down the left, would keep down the German Jewish left, because the Jewish left at the time in Germany was, of course, and in Eastern Europe was split between and later on more between Bundists and Zionists, the left, and Zionism was presenting itself as an anti-socialist and an anti-left-wing movement that would be useful to European empires. So, I mean, this, no matter what emphasis you want to put on it, on it strategically and in terms of campaigns, and whether you want to make it this campaign or that campaign, I think that's just an objective reality. And we see that down through the decades. And that is very much what happened in recent years in the Labour Party, I think.
Yeah, but I think, Asa, I think in regards to this particular question, really the intervention and the level of intervention that we saw in the last few years in the UK is really an affront to British democracy. I mean, it was a clear intervention that went all the way, to the Israeli Prime Minister's office with his comments about Jeremy Corbyn. So while they
I agree with that. No, absolutely, I agree with that. It was absolutely undermining the British democratic process. I mean, I'm always a bit cautious about those kind of narratives, because it does sort of assume that the British. I think there's a danger that argument can. I know this isn't how you mean it, but it can come across as, there's nothing wrong with the British democratic process anyway, and the only problem is these kind of lobbies subverting them, which is not true. There's a lot of problems with British democracy in and of itself. But yeah, absolutely, I do definitely agree that the Israel lobby has absolutely undermined the British democratic process and the US democratic process as well. Esty mentioned before the ADL, and she alluded to the fact that the ADL ran a massive spy operation on behalf of the state of Israel. This is a really massive, it's a huge story that we know it amongst ourselves, but perhaps we don't remind people of it enough. On behalf of Israel, an ostensible civil rights group, supposedly the ADL, supposedly to combat anti-Jewish racism, in fact ran a spying operation on American citizens on behalf of Israel and apartheid South Africa, as it was at the time, the apartheid regime in South Africa. So yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but and you're also right. I mean, there are flaws. The flaws in the system, in the political system in both countries, certainly allows for this kind of thing to happen. Because I mean,
yeah,
there are mutual benefits. I mean, both sides benefit from this, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
At least in the UK, you were actually able to have a debate within the Labour Party at the high levels and pass these initiatives and declarations in support of Palestine on an actual party level. I'm envious of that personally here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I
think have a Labour Party conference with all those Palestinian flags. That alone is so remarkable compared to.
Yeah, but also at the same time, even at the Democratic Party conference some years ago, the grassroots were, against things about, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and so on and so forth. So, the grassroots is there. I think the difference in the UK is that the Labour Party is an actual political party with members, rather than.
Yes.
To be honest, that has its downsides too, because what they
did to you.
Yeah, because it meant that people could be expelled and suspended and disciplined and all this kind of stuff, where they can't really do that because you could just register as a Democrat, right?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that they went after Bernie not because he was Jewish, but because of his leanings towards socialist movements, and that he wanted to socialize things that Anya was saying should be socialized, our education system and our medical our healthcare system, and all these things that only work. Other countries, every other industrialized country has socialized medicine, not because it's just they fancy it. It's because it's the only economic model that works. I mean, yes, it's the right thing to do. All people, when they're sick, no matter what, should be able to get medical care, but it also is the only system that works. And I think that the things Bernie was talking about, they were more threatened by those leftist and socialist leanings than the fact that he was Jewish, although I'm sure there definitely were people that weren't happy about that. There, I was at a rally where a Nazi flag was unfurled.
Mm.
Yeah, well, we're kind of out of time. So I'd like to thank all of you for really a fantastic debate, conversation, I should say, for your invaluable input, your invaluable work on a day-to-day basis. I still think we should take Anya's sentence of walking with confidence of a winning movement and make a T-shirt.
Yeah.
And that, we should act and remain in solidarity with each other and with other groups who are fighting for similar causes, because that is where our strength lies. I also agree, from what I see, that on the grassroots level, there certainly is a lot of progress, and even the advent of Gilad Erdan, who otherwise is a racist buffoon, but obviously has had some successes, we can safely, I think, continue, because we are fighting for the right causes. And hopefully we'll see some progress sooner rather than later. Jamil, you want to maybe finish up with some housekeeping, and then we will let our wonderful panel get on with their day.
Yeah, just real quick, huge thank you to everybody for attending, from Corbyn to Sanders, our Zionist orgs trying to targeting progressive politicians. So there's going to be a follow-up email going out tomorrow or the day after with all of the panelists' Twitter handles and some of the articles and reporting that was cited today. So we encourage you to follow everyone on the panel, acquaint yourself with their orgs. You got Gray Zone, Electronic Intifada, and JVP Action. If you haven't already. We also encourage you to keep up with Miko's social media, because we're going to be doing more of these online events. So, hopefully this is the second of many. And lastly, we're going to be posting the recordings of this webinar. So just give us a little bit of time to get those posted. Keep an eye out. And the last thing I want to plug is the Miko Peled podcast, which Miko and I do together. It's a vehicle for us to dive into some of the more underreported issues in Palestine. And it's usually interview based, and we're usually highlighting these human rights defenders who are battling all kinds of injustice on the ground. So you can subscribe to that using Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. But yeah, huge thanks again to our amazing panel for their contributions and insights. And yeah, that's it. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you to Miko, Jamil, and Michael.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
So much for putting this together. It was really, you guys were great.
No problem.
Great.
And thanks to the audience too. We really appreciate it.
Great comments. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.